Good evening. Good evening to all of you.
Thank you.
Care amiche, cari amici. Questa sera abbiamo l'onore della conferenza Amos Anderson e professoressa Judith Herrin. Le conferenze Amos Anderson sono tenute all'Institutum Romanum Finlandiae annualmente dagli eminenti studiosi sugli argomenti relativi alle attività dell'istituto, allora storia antica e medievale, filologia classica, archeologia classica e storia dell'arte. E le conferenze sono intitolate al magnate finlandese Amos Anderson, fondatore dell'Institutum Romanum Finlandiae. E le conferenze sono organizzate in collaborazione con Föreningen Konstsamfundet, l'associazione fondata da Amos Anderson 1940. Amos Anderson lectures that are named after the founder of the Finnish Institute in Rome, Amos Anderson, have been held every year since 2000 by noted scholars of the Institute's research fields, ancient and medieval history, classical archaeology, classical philology, and art history. And the lectures are organized in cooperation with the association Föreningen Konstsamfundet that was founded in 1940 by Amos Anderson, who 10 years later, in 1950, donated the funds that enabled the Finnish state to buy Villa Lante for the Finnish Institute. And the Finnish Institute was finally inaugurated on April 29, 1954. And tonight, we are honored to present Professor Judith Herrin for the annual Amos Anderson lecture. Professor Judith Herrin is Professor Emeritus of Late Antique and Byzantine Studies and the Constantine Leventis Senior Research Fellow at King's College, London. She was awarded her PhD at the University of Birmingham after studies of history at Newnham College, Cambridge. She has worked at the British School at Athens and in Istanbul as a Dumbarton Oaks Fellow. From 1991 until 1995, she was Stanley J. Seeger Professor in Byzantine History at Princeton University before her appointment as Professor of Late Antique and Byzantine Studies at King's College, London in 1995, where she was head of Center for Hellenic Studies. And Professor Herrin won the Dr. A.H. Heineken Prize for History in 2016 for her pioneering research into medieval cultures in Mediterranean civilizations and for establishing the crucial significance of the Byzantine Empire in history. Judith Herrin's publications have received praise by numerous scholars of late antique, Byzantine, and medieval history. Her most important studies include the Formation of Christendom from 1987, Women in Purple, Rulers of Medieval Byzantium from 2001, Byzantium, The Surprising Life of a Medieval Empire from 2007, Unrivaled Influence, Women and Empire in Byzantium, 2013. And now her latest important study, Ravenna, Capital of Empire, Crucible of Europe from Princeton University Press. And in her new book, Ravenna, Capital of Empire, Crucible of Europe, Professor Herrin writes the history of East and West in the Mediterranean world from the 5th to the 8th century, showing the crucial role of Ravenna played in the development of early Christendom. Judith Herrin's new study shows us Ravenna's lasting influence on the culture of Europe and the West, as a cultural and political capital, the first truly European city, as she says. And before I give the word to Professor Herrin, I will just tell that you will be able to ask questions afterwards, after the lecture. And I invite you to write your questions in the chat function that you find below on the lowest level of the screen, so that during the lecture, so that you can start writing your questions and we can have the discussion afterwards. So I'm really happy to have Judith Professor Herrin with us tonight. And the topic of her lecture is Ravenna and the roots of European identity. And now we will go to the technical part of starting the lecture, so that we will share the screen and you will see the beautiful slides that Judith, Professor Herrin, will show to us all. So just a moment, it will start. Please.
Thank you so much, Karja. Thank you so much for this invitation, for your lovely introduction. It is a great honor for me to be addressing you this evening, and I just regret very much that it cannot be in person because of these problems with the COVID. However, it is a great pleasure for me to talk about my new book with you tonight. If we could have the first slide. This evening, I would like to show you Ravenna by taking you around on a short walk. Now, while many of you may know the city very well, I'm not assuming that everyone is familiar with it. This is partly because I'm constantly surprised by people, for example, London people who say, oh, yes, I've never really been north to Liverpool or Newcastle. So I thought perhaps we should have a short walk around Ravenna. And if you know the city very well, I hope you won't mind visiting again. And here we are standing outside the walls, looking at what remains of the Porta Aurea, the Golden Gate, erected by the Emperor Claudius in the year AD 43. And this was a central major entry into the city, later fortified, as you can see from the medieval seal on the left, which with very stout brick walls, which thwarted many an enemy. Ravenna was built on islands separated by canals and waterways that formed in the delta of the River Po, creating a marshy environment that was most accessible from the sea. And on the Adriatic coast, Julius Caesar had designated the major port of Classis to serve the Eastern Mediterranean. When Emperor Honorius decided to leave his capital city of Milan in 402 AD, Ravenna presented the combination of a very well-protected site, linked through its large harbor to the entire Mediterranean and to the imperial capital itself, Constantinople. He may have established his residence in the palace of the local provincial governor or the commander of the naval fleet, the two leading Roman officials who now gave way to the emperor. Ravenna became the capital of the Roman Empire in the West. Next, please. Next slide, please. You see the Porta Aurea in the southern part of the city, in the southwestern part of the city. And if we enter through the gate and cross over the Lamisa, you can see the bridge over the Lamisa, one of the many canals that divided the city, we shall visit the cathedral church. This was originally constructed by Bishop Ursus and bears his name, the Ursiana. Then we'll follow the Padena River up to the northwest area of the city to find the site of many important monuments associated with the Empress Galla Placidia. We move east to her Basilica of San Giovanni Evangelista. You see it across the Piazza Maggiore, near to the area of the Imperial Palace, later used by kings and exarchs. And then we can visit the palace church built by the Gothic king Theodoric in the early 6th century, a vast basilica near his residence, now Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, and his mausoleum just outside the walls to the north of the city. Finally, we'll return to the northwest corner again to reach the church dedicated to San Vitale that attracts most tourist attention. You can see that this is a multi-layered history of many monuments that survive from the 5th and 6th centuries, with a few later additions. In 402, when Emperor Honorius arrived in Ravenna, he probably assisted Bishop Ursus in the construction of a grand new basilica for the city. Its revetted walls and mosaic vaults are described by Agnellus, the 9th century local historian, with the names of some of the patrons or artists who worked on it. But this church was demolished and rebuilt in the 18th century. Still, we can admire some elegant early Christian sarcophaguses kept there, and in the next slide you see them. There is also the sculpted ambo, witness to the skills of local craftsmen. Since Honorius ruled from Ravenna for over 20 years, he must have built quite extensively. For example, the Mint, recently excavated, but little survives from his reign. It's his younger half-sister, Galla Placidia, whose architectural achievements reveal the city's growth into its role as the new imperial capital. She appears to have settled in the northwest corner of the city, where she dedicated a large basilica church to the Holy Cross, which has been partially excavated. Next, please. It was also decorated in mosaic and marble revetment. This fragment on the left, which is now in the museum, indicates the extreme care taken by the mosaicists in the gradations of blue used to create a night sky. And there were inscriptions that recorded her patronage. Next slide. At the end of this, at the west end of this now lost church, a long transverse corridor led to 2 chapels, and it's the one at the south on the right side, which is now known as the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia. Next, please. Here you see it with the tower, the bell tower of the present church of Santa Croce in the background. This is the monument that made such an impression upon me during my first visit to Ravenna as a teenager, with its starry sky, doves drinking at fountains, and geometric patterns. Next, please. The figure approaching his flaming grid of martyrdom at the far end. This may be San Lorenzo, but has also been identified as Christ, or San Vincenzo, a Spanish saint known to Galla Placidia. Next, please. In this area of the city, the empress probably built or adapted an earlier structure for her own palace, from which she dominated the imperial administration in Ravenna from 425 to 437. She ruled in the name of her young son Valentinian III until he gained his majority, went to Constantinople to marry Licinia Eudoxia, daughter of the Emperor Theodosius II, and brought her back to occupy the imperial palace. The family's genealogy was displayed in another of Galla Placidia's foundations. In the next slide, please. This is the Basilica of San Giovanni Evangelista, which was almost completely destroyed by Allied bombing in 1944. Only these polygonal apses survive in their original state. Fortunately, 18th century antiquarians had documented the interior decoration, which we see on the next slide. So this is a picture of the images that the antiquarians drew when they entered the and saw the apse church, with apse of the church, with its enormous inscriptions recording the vow of the Empress Galla Placidia, and the roundels over the arch of the apse, which document her descent from Constantine the Great, whom she claimed as an ancestor, and her grandfather Valentinian I. In this way, she combined the two imperial dynasties to which she belonged. Her father, Theodosius I, her uncle Gratian, her second husband Constantius, and her children were also represented, together with her two young brothers, Gratian and John, who both died in childhood. This unprecedented display of imperial propaganda within a church, together with Bishop Peter Chrysologos, who was displayed below just above the episcopal chair, officiating at the altar. This sets a pattern that proved very influential in Ravenna. We shall find similar portraits in many other churches. Some were later rebuilt in more fashionable styles, others simply disappeared. The very small proportion of early Christian building that survives is a constant reminder of what we have lost. Galla Placidia, for instance, is known to have built in Rimini, to have commissioned liturgical furniture, such as a huge candelabrum that weighed 7 pounds, and a gold chalice dedicated to Saint Zacharias, perhaps like this one. Next slide, please. Her son, Valentinian III, also built a palace and churches in the city, but he preferred to live in Rome, and he moved the entire imperial court there in 450. As a result, the city's ecclesiastical leaders took on a leading role in the construction and decoration of the city. Next slide, please. Bishop Neon, who held office from 451 to 473, was particularly active, and the restored baptistry next to the Orsiana Cathedral contains his most famous legacy, the scene of the baptism in the dome. Next slide, please. Here is the baptism scene, flanked by the apostles, with brilliant marble and stucco decoration of the octagonal arches below. This ecclesiastical patronage thus almost certainly kept a considerable number of experienced mosaicists employed. Bishop Neon also built a dining room within the episcopal palace and a church dedicated to the apostles, now San Francesco, where he was buried close to the crypt. Next slide, please. The church of San Giovanni Evangelista was quite close to the palace area, occupied by emperors and later rulers of Ravenna. But when this was excavated in the early 20th century, very little remained. Much had been destroyed by the high water level. If we have the next slide, you will see it on the map. It is to the east and north of San Giovanni Evangelista, a large area which was excavated and the water level was very, very high. The area in gray, now marked Palace of the Exarchs, is where more remains were found in later excavations. So this is the area which produced some fine mosaics in the next slide. And we can admire them today in the area very close to the area of the palace, where they have been put on display in the second story of what's called the Palace of the Exarchs, but was in fact a church. On the left, you see a charioteer with the name Generosus at the bottom, and on the right, the way these mosaics are now laid out so that you can actually admire the mosaic work of several centuries. And there are many hippodrome scenes with spectators who watch the races with excitement. And then we can visit the palace chapel constructed by the Gothic king Theodoric in the early 6th century. Next slide, please. This is a vast basilica near to his residence, now known as Sant'Apollinare Nuovo. We have to imagine the impact of this large church, sited in relation to the king's palace, with the monumental equestrian statue that Theodoric had erected in front of it, in imitation of the statue of Justinian in Constantinople. The interior decoration included depictions of his port at Classis and his palace at Ravenna, cityscapes in which he originally appeared. Next slide, please. Here's the palace. This unusual combination of regal portraiture in a church goes back to Galla Placidia's genealogy and the Catholic claim of descent from the first Christian emperor. Theodoric's images, he would originally have been displayed seated on his throne under the inscription Palatium, now all gold. This in his original portrait was taken away by Archbishop Agnellus in the 560s. Next slide, please. And we can see the image, the half images of the courtiers between the columns and their hands that were left behind. The king had no comparably glamorous ancestry. Next slide, please. But he made his claim to rule Ravenna and a very large area of the West in the same way. He also adapted the imperial style of mausoleum for his own tomb, an impressive monument we can visit just outside the city walls. Next slide, please. Theodoric clearly developed a cult of his own achievements, celebrated in portraits and statues in many cities, and his supporters adapted it with inscriptions that even call him Augustus, which he did not use, title he did not use. Not far from the palace area, Theodoric provided the cathedral for the Goths, today Santo Spirito, with a baptistry. Next slide. And this is modeled on the earlier one of Bishop Neon with similar mosaic decoration. The ground level has risen well over a meter, which is why it appears rather squat. Next slide. In this Arian structure, the dome reveals the much younger Jesus, not the 30-year-old fully bearded figure of the 5th century version. But if we compare it with the earlier one, in the next slide, we can see the Orthodox baptistry of Bishop Neon on the left and the Arian baptistry built by Theodoric on the right. The differences between the figures, I think, hint that at the Arian doctrine that the Son did not share in the same essence as the Father, but was generated by the Father and naturally inferior to God the Father. These Arian foundations record the domination of the Goths in Ravenna between 493 and 540. As a minority of the population, they had to coexist with other religious groups and practiced a much greater tolerance of Catholics and Jews than was found among Vandals or Visigoths. Yes, there were attacks on synagogues in Ravenna, but the local Jewish population survived. And you can see this from the next slide, which is a fragment of an amphora neck with an inscription reading Shalom. As we return to the northwestern corner of the city, the House of the Stone Carpets provides a detour into the richly decorated villas of late Roman inhabitants. And finally, we reach the most impressive church dedicated to San Vitale. Next slide, please. Its unusual structure, based on an octagonal plan that supports a high dome, was rare, while its mosaic decoration is exceptional. Construction began in the reign of Theodoric under Bishop Ecclesias, who held office from 522 to 532. And he is commemorated as the founder, presenting the church to Christ. Next slide, please. The Arian king permitted the Catholic planning of this very ambitious building, which took many years to complete. Ecclesias's successor, Ursicinus, carried on the work, and Bishop Victor's monogram on the capitals imported from the marble quarries at Proconnesos in the Sea of Marmara identifies his contribution to the ambulatory. Next slide, please. When Belisarius recaptured Ravenna in 540 with imperial forces sent from Constantinople, most of the mosaic decoration of the apse may have been completed with its Old Testament references to Moses, Elijah, Abraham, and Melchizedek. Bishop Victor probably wished to mark the end of the Gothic regime and the resulting Catholic supremacy in the city with some recognition of the imperial conquest. Next slide, please. I think it very likely that the imperial panels were installed before Victor's death in 544 and featured himself as the ecclesiastic standing next to the emperor. That portrait was replaced by the first Archbishop of Ravenna, Maximian, who established his position late in 546 and dedicated the church on the 19th of April, 547. Next slide, please. Imperial funding may not have been necessary, as Julianus Argentarius, the banker, had contributed a significant sum. He also assisted both Victor and later Maximian in completing the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare at Classe and San Michele in Africisco. Imperial support, however, may be implied by the very grand ivory throne still preserved in the Archiepiscopal Museum. Next slide, please. Such a large quantity of ivory might well have come from imperial depots in Constantinople, though possible indirect evidence of ivory carving in Ravenna has recently been collected by Maria Cristina Carile. Maximian clearly had close relations with the emperor, made several visits to Constantinople from Ravenna, and obtained a relic in the form of the beard of St. Andrew. Finally, we need to walk out to Classe, which is now many kilometers from the sea, to admire the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare, the site of the martyr's shrine. Next slide, please. This must have been a walk frequently made by clergy, pilgrims, and citizens who wanted to venerate the relics of Sant'Apollinaris. In 678 or 9, for instance, the historian Agnellus records that on Christmas Eve, the clergy of the Church of Ravenna were so angry with their archbishop that they left the city and all walked to Classis to appeal to their patron saint for help. The following morning, the archbishop found no priest or deacon in the city ready to celebrate the Christmas feast with him. There was a complete standoff, only resolved by the exarch, Theodore, who rode out to Classis to persuade the clergy to return. The Basilica of Sant'Apollinare in Classe, built to enclose the martyr's relics, had also been begun by Ecclesias and continued by Ursicinus, and was only dedicated by Maximian on the 9th of May, 549. Next slide, please. In a magical Garden of Paradise setting, Apollinaris appears as the first bishop of Ravenna under a large jeweled cross with Christ at the center, below the hand of God, with Moses and Elijah to either side. In addition to the 4 previous bishops, 2 panels either side of the altar now display very interesting 7th century mosaics. Next slide, please. On the north side, the commemoration of Imperial Constans II and Constantine IV, and on the south side opposite, Melchizedek, the high priest, is shown in the same scene as at San Vitale. In 662, Constans II had moved his court from Constantinople to Syracusa in Sicily, and Ravenna was ordered to contribute to his expensive reforms, mainly concerned with naval forces. Here we can admire the portrayal of Archbishop Maurus, now deceased, and his successor Reparatus, receiving a scroll marked Privilegia from Emperor Constantine IV, all the figures named in the accompanying inscriptions. These panels are obviously modeled on the 6th century ones in San Vitale and use the same borders and patterns in a rich range of colors and decorative shapes. Sant'Apollinare in Classe also became the burial church of most bishops, so there are lots of tombs. Next slide, please. Here you see the tomb of Bishop John. And for those who are not exhausted by such a rapid tour of Ravenna, there is much to admire in the new archaeological park under construction, with finds from the excavations of the harbor warehouses, including vessels imported from all over the Mediterranean. But I will now return to the city and its significance in European history. Next slide, please. Here is Charlemagne's most obvious debt. He visited the city 3 times and removed columns and marbles for his palace and church at Aachen, as well as Theodoric's equestrian statue. Even if they are no longer identifiable in his new buildings, the octagonal form employed for his palace church is clearly modeled on San Vitale and demanded unusual skills from his builders. I think the Frankish emperor had also stood in front of the imperial mosaic panels in San Vitale and had taken just inspiration from Justinian's grandeur. This is how to be an emperor. He may also have seen images of King Theodoric, another non-Roman ruler who sustained a quasi-imperial rule over many provinces of the old Roman Empire. And he, Charlemagne, put up the huge equestrian statue from Ravenna in front of his palace at Aachen, just as he had seen it dominating the administrative center of Ravenna. This is the end of the slides. So in addition to this immediate transfer of ideas about the representation of authority, which I think is manifested in Charlemagne's borrowings from Ravenna, I'd like to emphasize 3 aspects of Ravenna's history, which became more evident to me as I was working on it, when my original aim had been to understand why the city was a center of such artistic brilliance. And here I'm speaking with no special expertise, just looking at the wider implications of my title. First, during the period of early Christendom, the Mediterranean world was not divided into East and West. It remained the Roman See, now governed from the city of Constantine, New Rome, the Queen City of Constantinople. The hegemonic stature of the empire was recognized, however grudgingly, by most political leaders and authorities of this world and beyond it. This can be seen in the numerous ways in which imperial attributes like costume and regalia and activities like law-giving persisted among non-Romans. Theodoric is the most striking example, and of course that's partly because he had spent a critical decade of his youth in the palace of the emperors as a hostage. That period of exposure to 5th century imperial practice, not just ceremonial feasting and religious ritual, but also military and diplomatic activity, economic planning, artistic patronage, intellectual debate, had given him a very immediate sense of how to rule a vast empire. Indeed, in Constantinople, he had been educated and trained to perform such an imperial role. Yet at the same time, he observed that the leading general, Aspar, and his son Ardabor, who dominated the imperial administration, were Germanic Aryans, outsiders like himself. But his contemporary, Clovis, king of the Franks, also cherished the title of Patricius and rode into Paris, scattering coin to the crowd in an imperial fashion. most non-Roman rulers of the Western provinces issued law codes that derived from imperial law. They hosted great dinners in Roman style and commissioned skilled orators to sing their praises in verses modeled on imperial panegyrics. They also asserted their own non-Roman identities and condemned the influence of the emperors ruling in Constantinople. But the notion that the Mediterranean world was divided into a distinct West as opposed to an East is a back projection of our own historic perspective. It's not just that there was a constant coming and going across the sea, a sharing of drinking vessels, cooking pots, writing material, and cloth, as well as the luxuries of the Far East, silk, jewels, spices, and ivory. It's that these flowed all around in a single world. Secondly, there is a problem in naming this period. Until recently, it was known as late antiquity, a term widely adopted from Peter Brown's seminal book, The World of Late Antiquity. As a result of writing Ravenna, however, I've found it increasingly inappropriate because these centuries were not inextricably marked by decline and antiquarianism, but rather looked forward to a newly Christianized and expanding civilization with new forms of organization. This period was not an aftermath to antiquity, but formed a distinctly different one, early Christendom. And this new name, in turn, changes our perspectives. In contrast to the ancient gods, the one God was held responsible for revelations to the Jews and Christians, and indeed in final form to the Muslims as well. And this monotheistic insistence appealed both to those within and far beyond the frontiers of the Roman world. It is a new religious dominance that separates the medieval from the ancient world and molds all that follows right up to today, as we know all too well. This decisive shift creates a specific early medieval culture open to all those whose lives were regulated by the longing for salvation, to attain life in the hereafter. The same emphasis on religious definition and ritual performance witnessed the birth of Muslim civilization, usually recognized as early Islamic, and the early medieval Babylonian Jewish community. The end precisely when these changes occurred and their definition. For instance, the late antiquity or the earlier Middle Ages should be related to this more fundamental dominance of religious belief. Thirdly, in Ravenna, I think we can identify some of the characteristics of what became Europe by the end of the period under review, around 800 AD. Beyond the multilingual culture of many major port cities, Ravenna had been marked by a greater tolerance of difference, partly because the Arian Gothic invaders of the late 5th century were a minority and had to come to terms with the much larger population of Catholic Christians. Theodoric stated clearly that he couldn't force anyone to believe against their will, and he and his daughter and successor, Amalasuintha, permitted the city's Catholic bishops to build ever grander churches. This contrasts sharply with Vandal persecution of the Catholic clergy in Africa and Visigothic treatment of Jewish communities in Spain, where legal coexistence was denied. And Theodoric ordered that those responsible for challenging the right to worship should be punished. Witness the order that after a Christian attack on the synagogues in Ravenna, the city's bishop was obliged to contribute to the rebuilding of the monuments. This is in marked contrast with a comparable attack in the East, where the Bishop of Kallinikos refused to assist in making good the damage to the synagogue and was supported by the emperor in Constantinople. Similarly, Theodoric permitted the Jews of Genoa to replace the roof of their synagogue, though not to extend it. This underlying principle of relative tolerance was much quoted by later Protestant reformers and should be understood as a European tradition. In addition, the significance of the symbiosis between imperial traditions and Germanic Gothic practice, which was achieved under Theodoric, drew on his Constantinopolitan experience and long migration that brought Goths, like so many other non-Roman peoples, into the sphere of imperial influence. In Ravenna, it extended to other migrating groups in flight from the Avars and was consolidated under the exarchs appointed by Constantinople to govern Italy in an imperial style, with documentary records kept in triplicate, orders sealed by lead seals which identified the author, an effective tax system, and a court hierarchy with eunuchs to organize the ceremonial, where literary, intellectual, and artistic accomplishments were recognized and supported. These became widespread within the medieval West in due course. They were, however, first manifested in Ravenna, a city which can justifiably claim the title Crucible of Europe. We can begin to grasp the importance of Ravenna when we consider the professional skills that were nurtured in the city. Greek doctors and Syrian merchants, along with teachers of letters, legal experts, craftsmen of all varieties, and translators. The city's scriptoria are poorly documented, but from Gothic Bibles written in gold and silver ink on purple parchment to the liturgical roll and copy of the Vitas Patrum in Latin translation, there is no doubt about their activity. Around the year 700, the anonymous cosmographer used a wide range of sources to compile his account of the creation of the world and its parts, reflecting an awareness of the ancient past through classical texts, using Gothic resources, the names on the maps like the Tabula Peutingeriana, and manifesting efforts to trace the sun's movements across the meridian. Latitudes were measured and calculated. The cosmographer had difficulty explaining where the sun went after it sank below the horizon of the Western Ocean, though he accepted the principle of a spherical Earth. But these were problems that taxed all astronomers and geographers of early Christendom. Within this newly Christianized West, two features of the classical inheritance enhanced the formation of a European identity. The first is to be found in Roman legal traditions in the form of written texts of the Theodosian and Justinianic codifications that continued to influence the exercise of justice, even when customs such as physical bodily punishment for personal damage became widespread. Roman law also remained in force in medieval formulations in Byzantium, and in formulations that circulated in the Balkans for many centuries after. And of course, Roman law retains this dominance within the modern European legal system today. The second element lies in the profound respect for ancient literary culture that inspired many generations who lived in European regions through the medieval and early modern centuries. Nowadays, such devotion to the classics may become an impediment to a broader global education. In Britain, it continues to exalt a particular form of private schooling, which contributes to very deleterious class divisions. But in the millennium from 800 to 1800, ancient Greek and Latin authors inspired a vast range of literary and scientific endeavor, and the survival of the classical texts depended upon medieval scribes, often monastic, who copied and commented on the words of Homer, Aristotle, Ptolemy, Caesar, and Cicero, to name only a few. Again, the contributions of medieval experts in both East and West were decisive, and the involvement of Muslim scholars using translations into Arabic added additional brilliance. Long before the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, Byzantine teachers were bringing their Greek manuscripts to Italy, where local translators produced Latin versions in a cooperative exploration of these basic texts. And Ravenna takes its share of responsibility for the survival of both the legal and literary inheritance of the ancient world into the modern. In conclusion, I think we can see some roots of a European character in Ravenna's capacity to construct a dynamic combination of older principles of city government and organization, economic and social as well as political, and future ideas the city was striving to realize through what became self-conscious ecclesiastical leadership. The struggle to hold both together in an adaptable coexistence generated creativity and consolidated strengths while developing new skills. The linking of this old and new is what helps to create a distinct European identity so different from the new world of the Americas, where indigenous culture was effectively killed, or the Chinese, where most eras were dominated by one central political authority, imperial power, strengthened by the existence of a very ancient, shared, written script. Although Europe also experienced many, many centuries of autocratic government, Habsburg, Napoleonic, Prussian, corners always escaped their control and preserved local vernaculars and political ambitions. The efforts to conquer, many efforts to conquer Europe by Scandinavian, Russian, Ottoman forces reflect its wealth of resources which were deemed admirable and desirable, even though conflict between its many parts is built into its long history. But through all the wars and devastation, some notion of European identity and relatively peaceful coexistence has survived until today. Can the EU make it work? In Britain today, there is a palpable sense of loss among those of us who wish to remain European. But this change is less problematic for Europe than the rise of regional leaders dedicated to undermining both the legal expression of dissent and the toleration of minorities. Let's hope that the shared history of so many centuries of living close together on the western tip of Eurasia will endow its current inhabitants with the determination to extend and deepen this cooperation and to preserve what they understand of European identity and the rule of law against the tides of American and Chinese domination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Herrin. It was just wonderful to hear your conclusions and your wonderful ideas about the creation of European identity, and that's something that we are experiencing in the whole Europe. The question about identity, what it is, and how can it be interpreted. And I have a couple of questions to start with, and then I have received one question until now, and you are all welcome to send your comments also in Italian. Anche in italiano potete spedire le domande e potremo poi tradurre le domande. So I would like to start by asking, I was wondering about the amount of literary sources, manuscripts, and the archives that survive in Ravenna. What do we have? What kind of material do we have? So that you can explain it to all the audience? What do we actually have at place? What has survived? What kind of sources do we have?
The most surprising and wonderful resources are the papyrus records, because documents were kept on papyrus, written on papyrus, imported from Egypt probably, in charcoal-based ink, and they are very fragmentary and very delicate, but they have survived, and there are many from the 5th and 6th and 7th and even into the 8th centuries. Unfortunately, they are very scattered now. They are not all in Ravenna, but they have been edited and brought together. And indeed, it was the great, I think, Danish archivist who traveled the world collecting them to Jeddah. And he published them with German translations. But they are an extraordinary resource, because every document, which is usually about property, gifts to the church, wills made by the bishop, wills made by individuals, these list first numbers of objects and describe agricultural holdings, lots of descriptions of houses and mills and orchards, also lists of clothing and valuables. And every document is witnessed by a list of witnesses who are residents of the city. And in this way, we have an extraordinary view into the population, very mixed. There are some witnesses who prefer to sign in Greek, using Greek letters. Others sign in Greek, but they are signing their Latin names, so it's just like an affectation. There are people who still sign in Gothic because they are Goths and identify in that way. And there are people of all stations, very high praetorian prefects who are of the highest senatorial rank, and those onesti of the lower station, but who may be bankers, who may have money of their own. And the variety and the range and the existence, the presence of women in these documents gives us a real insight into the population. This is, of course, only one aspect of Ravenna's history, but I found it quite extraordinary that it was so rich. There were, in the time, there was a list, there was a document which would have recorded the history of the city of Ravenna in an annalistic form, year by year. We know it existed because half a folio survives in the cathedral city, the cathedral treasury of Merseburg in Germany. Half a folio of a manuscript that must have been many folios thick and would have held records of what happened every year in the city or affected the city in some way. So in the half folio that we have, we know that there were several earthquakes that are dated. We know that several rebels, their heads were brought back into the city because they had been defeated and they were displayed on posts, on poles. These sorts of detail, just imagine if we had the whole of the annals of Ravenna. So we know that records were kept, but have not survived. And this is like as with the churches, we have such a tiny fraction of what was originally created, but we must make the best of it. And I think there is also a very great debt we owe to the archaeologists who are constantly discovering new things about the history of Ravenna. And the archaeology has been enormously increased and wonderful finds made so that we are able to expand our knowledge and the resources that we have to write about the city and its place in the Mediterranean world. It's archaeology which has brought us that very wide purview of the entire Mediterranean with Klibani imported from Cyprus, amphoras of wine from Gaza and the Aegean, African red slipware from Africa, and all these imports which reflect the Mediterranean contacts that Ravenna benefited from. So again, we have an expanding notion of resource and material to work with.
Thank you. And now I have actually received also a question from our Amos Anderson scholar at the moment, scholar Frederick Whitling, who wishes to ask. He was inspired by your comments on architecture, and he's wondering if it's possible to elaborate on the octagonal shape and its pedigree, and what happened to it after Charlemagne in later periods. But that's of course more an architectural question, and he wonders if it did catch on, and if not, why not? I don't know if it's possible to comment on that.
Well, the pedigree and the origins of San Vitale are much disputed, because there is indeed a development to build an octagonal church with a dome in Constantinople at about the same time. And there are also circular churches with domes and octagonal tombs with very shallow domes. So there are other types of architecture that might be related. Did the architects, the engineers, we should call them really, these mechanici who put up such astonishing buildings, were they native to Ravenna? Did they bring their skills from somewhere else? Of course, in Milan, there is a fine octagonal church with a dome, and in Rome also the octagonal tomb of Santa Costanza and so on. So architects were, or builders were, able to construct octagons, but the fashion for an octagon was completely unknown north of the Alps. And that is why Aachen is such a striking chapel. The form of the church is complex. The height of the dome is enormous, so it has to have the most substantial foundations, as at San Vitale. And the only thing that I feel is quite interesting in this respect is a new book that I read, a study of the principles of constructing the base on which you can raise a dome. And there is a geometric relationship between the base and the size of the base and the size of the dome. And once you have this mathematical proportion correct, you can actually mark it out with ropes and markers. It's not as complicated, perhaps, as we imagined, once you understand the principles of sufficient base to support the dome. But it is an octagon. The octagon is very striking, and it is a wonderful shape for an ambulatory. As you walk around, it's very, very impressive. So Charlemagne, I think, must have been impressed with San Vitale and also with the mosaics that he saw on the wall there. Why it never caught on in the north? Well, perhaps they didn't have the mathematical principles that gave that relationship that made it possible to construct domes. It's true that their domes were not very commonly put up in Northern Europe.
And one more question concerning, I was still wondering, what do we know about Theodoric's and his followers' attitude towards classical literature?
Well, I imagine that when he arrived in Constantinople, aged about 8, he was put in a classroom with other children of that age, particularly boys, I suppose, who were supposed to be learning their Homer. There is no doubt that if you are an inhabitant of Constantinople in the 6th century, your education begins with Homer, whether you like it or not. And you learn the myths of the gods and the goddesses and their comings and goings, and the story of the War of Troy and Odysseus' return. And this is part of the very basic information that every educated person has to have. And even uneducated people may have known quite a lot of the stories in Homer. And of course, he was doing this in Greek, and so he was learning a new language, because his original language was Gothic. And because there was also a very determined effort to keep the language of the law in Latin, it may well have been that he was learning enough Latin to understand that Roman law was originally in Latin and was very, very important. But he spent his years from 8 to 18 in the capital city, growing up in this very, very lively, brilliant atmosphere, trilingual, but aware of his identity as a Goth and an Arian Christian, not a Catholic Christian, being forced to worship outside the walls in the churches that were reserved to the Arians and so on. So he must have had a very mixed relationship with the imperial capital, and I think that must have extended to classical literature. What we know from the evidence of his occupation of Ravenna is that he supported the production of Gothic Bibles in this most elaborate and brilliant and amazing luxury, the purple dyed parchment with all the Gothic gospel texts written in gold and silver ink, decorated as well. I mean, even if these were deluxe objects not made in very large numbers, that was a major investment and had to be supported possibly by Theodoric. But in addition, it's clear that the clergy of the Arian church were making commentaries on the Arian texts, the texts of Arius himself, and subsequent Arian sermons and collections of hymns, and documentation about the theology of Arius as it had been developed. So he had a very specific attitude to religious culture, and to what extent he was interested in other literary forms, I do not know.
That's really exciting. So to know that actually how he promoted literature and culture in during his life, and especially then in Ravenna. Do we have any more questions? We have actually here very many greetings, and especially Katja Koskinen here says, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, and Period Album, thank you for this clear and interesting presentation. And of course, Katarina Mustakallio, the president of the board of the Finnish Institute, thanking also for the very inspiring lecture. And that's means also that we now have to read very thoroughly your book to learn more about Ravenna and the life in Ravenna during these centuries, from the 5th to the 8th century. And here, Professor Outi Merisalo from the University of Jyväskylä is thanking you very much, and Kurt Jagobotera from the ICCS faculty wants to thank you as well. So that and now we have also recorded the lecture so that it will be available in the channel, YouTube channel of the Institute.
Any chance to say something?
Yes, please, Paavo Lipponen.
Dear Professor Herrin, thank you for a fascinating presentation. As I got both Constantinople and Aachen in my family roots, I've been fascinated by many places, and Ravenna is one of them. I've visited Constantinople and Aachen. There are so many questions, like I think it was really interesting what you said about the roots of Christianity or Western Christianity. I would like to refer also to the role of Arab culture.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, you're familiar with the book Cairo, City Invincible, and how important Cordoba was.
Yes.
Later. But my question is, would you like to characterize the significance of the Carolingian Empire in the evolution of Europe and Western civilization. It was a rather short bit, but still. Would you like to comment on this?
Thank you so much. It was very significant, of course. My feeling is that the Carolingian contribution to the formation of Europe has been brilliantly analyzed and is very well understood, partly because Charlemagne made a point of collecting scholars with different interests and different skills from many different places, bringing them together to make a critical mass of intellectual activity and endeavor. His sons were not as successful in sustaining that policy, but there's absolutely no doubt that the title Pater Europas was well deserved. Not only did Charlemagne rule over a large part of Europe, but he also drew on the different skills that he found to impose much higher standards of good Latin, better education, a more profound understanding of Christian doctrine, many reforms that gave a European-wide culture, created a culture that spread all over Europe. And that was a great achievement, though, as you say, rather brief. My aim in the thing that I discovered, it was not my aim. The thing that I discovered in writing about Ravenna was that there were so many earlier manifestations of a similar effort to bring together, to synthesize, and to harmonize different cultures and different ways of doing things in Ravenna that I think has been overlooked. And therefore I want to push back the roots of this European culture even further.
Thank you, Professor. I think that there's another ruler who deserves credit in this chain of historical contexts. It's Alfred the Great.
Yes.
All was a similar.
Yes. So many of the Anglo-Saxon scholars that have illuminated European culture, I was fascinated to learn about the translations that he ordered. Many of them are from the Greek lives of saints. I believe they were really fictitious saints. They were not. They were narratives of an exciting variety, which he had translated into Anglo-Saxon. And that was another way in which ancient cultures came through to Anglo-Saxon England at a very early date. He and Bede are two more pinnacles in the Northern Hemisphere that we must never forget.
And his daughter was married to Carolingian.
Yes, so they had good contacts across the channel.
Thank you.
Thank you. And here we have also, so the Paavo Lipponen and also Paavo Hohti, both are members of the delegation of the Finnish Institute. So that also Paavo Hohti is here thanking very much, Professor Herrin. And we have greetings and thanks also from Germana Graziosi, and Antonio from Ravenna is confident. He's writing here, I'm confident I'm interpreting the feelings of all the Ravennati attending this excellent presentation by saying that we look forward to welcoming you all to Ravenna as soon as conditions will allow. And my colleague also from Helsinki University, Marilena Hänninen, I think is saying here, thank you so much for a most fascinating lecture. And yes, we all have to visit Ravenna as soon as it is possible again.
I agree.
So that's definitely something that we all have to do. I just love all the beautiful churches and mosaics in Ravenna. And of course, one thing that I have always been dreaming of, that we also all should to do some time to take part in a summer school of making mosaics, where you learn to make mosaics. So that's something that you can do. And probably in antiquity, many persons came also. Certainly, artisans came to Ravenna to learn these specific skills.
I'm sure.
Sculptors and mosaic artists and painters, certainly. So that that's really something that we all are looking forward to read the book of Professor Herrin and to visit Ravenna as soon as we can. Thank you so much. It has been a wonderful evening for all of us.
Entirely my pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. It's been lovely thing to do.
Thank you. And now we will give this pleasure to all the people and listeners also afterwards with this video. Thank you once more to all. Grazie mille. Abbiamo anche alcuni ravennati, so that they are both international scholars, not only Finnish and Swedish and Italian here, but I see also from people from other countries. Also a former director of a Danish institute, Marianne Pade, if I see it right. So that many who wanted to hear this wonderful lecture. Thank you once more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.